You think people who don't explain themselves are rude. You think they're arrogant, emotionally unavailable, or hiding something. You assume they just don't care enough to communicate properly. But psychology says something completely different. The truth is, people who refuse to over-explain are operating from a psychological position most people never reach, and the reasons reveal a lot about who they truly are. Let's break down what psychology actually says about people who don't explain themselves. 1. They've developed what psychologists call secure detachment from external validation. When you don't feel the need to justify your choices, it means your nervous system isn't in constant threat detection mode waiting for approval. Research shows this comes from a deeply rooted sense of self-worth that doesn't require constant reinforcement from others. This psychological independence protects them from the exhausting cycle of people-pleasing that traps most of the population. 2. Their prefrontal cortex has learned to override the social anxiety response that makes most people scramble to fill silence with explanations. Psychology calls this high distress tolerance. They can sit in the discomfort of someone's disappointment or confusion without their stress hormones hijacking their behavior. This means they've trained their brain to prioritize authenticity over the temporary relief that comes from making others comfortable, which is a level of emotional regulation most people spend years in therapy trying to achieve. 3. They understand the psychological principle of diminishing returns in communication. When you over-explain, you're often trying to control how someone perceives you, which psychologists recognize as an anxiety-driven behavior, not a clarity-driven one. They've learned that people who are meant to understand you will, and people who aren't won't be convinced by 1,000 words. This cognitive efficiency protects their energy and filters their relationships automatically. 4. Research shows they have what's called an internal locus of control, meaning they've shifted the power source for their self-concept inward instead of outward. They don't need to walk you through their thought process, because they're not seeking your co-signature on their decisions. This isn't arrogance, it's psychological sovereignty. They've done the deep work of trusting themselves first, which actually makes them more reliable and consistent because they're not shape-shifting based on who's in the room. 5. They've recognized the psychological trap of defensive communication. Psychologists call this the justification spiral, where every explanation invites more questions, more judgment, and more emotional labor. They've learned that explaining yourself to someone who's already decided you're wrong is like teaching physics to someone who doesn't believe in gravity. This boundary protects them from circular conversations that drain energy and produces zero understanding. 6. Their mirror neuron system is highly developed, meaning they have exceptional emotional intelligence about what's actually happening beneath the surface. They can feel when someone's question isn't really a question, it's a judgment disguised as curiosity. Psychology shows that people with this level of social perception learn to conserve their emotional resources for connections that are genuine, not performative. They're not being difficult, they're being selective about where they invest their psychological energy. 7. They've internalized what researchers call radical self-acceptance, which means they've made peace with the fact that they will be misunderstood and they've decided that's acceptable. Most people are terrified of being misunderstood because it threatens their social survival instincts. But these individuals have upgraded their psychological operating system to prioritize inner peace over universal approval. This gives them a kind of freedom that people who constantly explain themselves will never experience. So if you're someone who doesn't explain yourself, you're not cold, difficult, or uncaring. You're psychologically sovereign, emotionally efficient, and deeply self-aware. If you want more psychology videos that explain the parts of you nobody talks about, hit that subscribe button right now, because the next video might be the one that finally makes you feel seen,